Imagine yourself transported back to the year 1848 into a quiet Boston photography studio. Picture a young girl, no older than 5, carefully positioned in a wicker chair, her favorite doll cradled in her lap. Her eyes are open, her head tilted just so, as if she's merely drifted off during play. Behind the large, imposing camera, her parents stand, their faces streaked with tears, patiently waiting out the agonizing 15-minute exposure. This single photograph would be their sole tangible memory of their precious daughter, who had passed away just 2 days prior. Welcome to the poignant and, at times, deeply unsettling world of Victorian post-mortem photography. In an era marked by immense grief and high mortality rates, particularly among children, families would pay significant sums to have their recently departed loved ones immortalized in photographs. These weren't hidden, shameful mementos, quite the opposite. These images were often proudly displayed in family albums, hung above fireplaces, and even carried in lockets, serving as a cherished, albeit melancholic, connection to those they had lost. At first glance, the practice might seem macabre. Why would grieving parents prop up their deceased children with hidden stands, painstakingly paint eyes onto closed eyelids, or even hire artists to add a lifelike blush to the cheeks of a corpse? The answer lies in understanding the harsh realities of Victorian life and the profound human need to cope with unimaginable sorrow. While these historical images can be confronting, they offer a unique window into how people in the past grappled with death and preserved the memory of their loved ones. The genesis of post-mortem photography is rooted in the grim statistics of Victorian childhood. In 1850s England, a staggering 20% of children never reached their 5th birthday. In some American cities, this figure climbed to 30%. Diseases like scarlet fever, diphtheria, and cholera could claim a healthy child in a matter of days. It was a pervasive reality. If you had 5 children, statistically, one might not live to adulthood. This wasn't an abstract concept, it was the lived experience of nearly every parent. The invention of daguerreotype photography in 1839 coincided precisely with this period of high mortality. For the first time, photography offered a way for middle-class families to capture images. However, there was a cruel irony. Photography was expensive and demanded long exposure times. Many families, thinking they had ample time, would postpone having a family portrait taken. Then, tragedy would strike. Suddenly, photography studios began offering a heartbreaking service. Studios like Southworth and Hoare in Boston would delicately advertise their ability to secure the shadow or the substance fade. Photographers would even travel to homes within hours of a death to capture that final, irreplaceable image. Post-mortem photography adhered to strict conventions designed to create the illusion of life. The most common pose was the last sleep, where children were arranged in beds or chairs as if merely napping. To achieve an upright pose, photographers employed special iron stands, hidden behind the subject, with clamps that would support the head and waist, becoming invisible when draped with clothing. Eyes presented a particular challenge. Sometimes the body would be positioned to make closed eyes appear as natural sleep. However, families often desired open eyes. In these cases, photographers would either prop eyelids open with wires or meticulously paint eyes onto the final photograph. The technical difficulties were immense. Early daguerreotypes required 15 to 20-minute exposures. Living subjects would inevitably blur from breathing, pulse, and tiny movements. The deceased, however, remained perfectly still. This created an eerie effect where the deceased appeared remarkably sharper and more present than any living family members in the same photo. A telltale sign of a post-mortem photograph is often the figure who seems most vivid and clearly defined. They were the ones who couldn't move. Children were photographed with exceptional care and tenderness. Photographers arrived with cases full of props, toys, flowers, books, even pets. The goal was always to capture the child as the parents remembered them in life. A girl who loved reading might be posed with her favorite book. A boy might hold his toy soldiers. Infants were frequently photographed in their mother's arms, carefully positioned to appear as if sleeping. The mothers' faces in these images are studies in controlled grief, as they strove to remain perfectly still for the long exposure while holding their lifeless child. The expense of these portraits was considerable. In 1850, a post-mortem photograph could cost between $2 to $5, at a time when an average laborer earned only €1 per day. For working-class families, this represented a week's wages or more. Yet, they paid willingly. For many, this would be the only image they would ever possess of their child. Photography was simply too expensive and cumbersome for casual family snapshots. Death provided both the urgent reason and the final opportunity. Some photographers gained renown for their sensitive post-mortem work. James Presley Ball in Cincinnati was particularly recognized for his compassionate treatment of African American families who often faced discrimination elsewhere. He famously wrote, "In death, all are equal before the camera. I capture not just faces, but the love that transcends mortality." His studio records from 1865 tragically document over 2,000 post-mortem portraits, each annotated with family names and causes of death, a heartbreaking catalogue of profound loss. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this practice was the lifelike enhancements applied after the photograph was taken. Families could pay extra for hand tinting that added rosy pink to cheeks and lips. Some photographers would paint open eyes directly onto the photographic plate itself. The Stiff Family Studio, a remarkably fitting name, in Pennsylvania even advertised lifelike effects added to bring comfort to the bereaved, promising to paint highlights to make deceased eyes appear to sparkle with life. Not all post-mortem photos aimed to deny death. Some embraced it with symbolic elements. Children might be photographed in their coffins, surrounded by flowers. These memorial portraits often included clear death symbols like wilted roses, broken columns, or clocks stopped at the time of death. Yet, even these more formal death portraits frequently depicted children with eyes open, hands carefully positioned, and faces turned toward the camera as if still aware. While children were the most common subjects, the practice wasn't limited to them. Adults were also photographed, though usually in more formal, undeniably deceased poses, often in their coffins. But children, especially those under 10, were almost always posed to appear alive. This reflected Victorian beliefs about childhood innocence, where children were seen as too pure for the corruption of death. Photographing them as if sleeping maintained the fiction of their untainted state. The family dynamics surrounding these photographs were intricate. Siblings were often posed alongside their deceased brothers or sisters, creating deeply unsettling images of living and dead children together. Parents wrestled with the decision of including surviving children, fearing both the immediate trauma of the experience and potential future trauma from the image itself. Many, however, chose to proceed, believing the photograph would help surviving siblings remember their lost loved one. The photographers themselves developed complex coping mechanisms. William Mumler, who later became famous for spirit photography, began his career with post-mortem portraits. He confided in his diary, "Each day I arrange the dead as if they live. I see parents' desperate hope that somehow the camera might capture more than mere flesh, might catch the departing soul itself." This desperate hope would later fuel the spiritualism movement's fascination with photographing ghosts. By the 1860s, post-mortem photography had spread across America, Europe, and into European colonies, each culture adapting it differently. Mexican post-mortem photography often incorporated religious elements, with children dressed as angels or saints. In India, British colonial families created elaborate tableaux with deceased children surrounded by flowers and Indian servants, unintentionally creating problematic images that merged grief with imperial power dynamics. The American Civil War further transformed the practice. Suddenly, families needed images of soldiers who died far from home. Battlefield photographers would capture portraits of fallen soldiers, hoping families might identify and purchase them. Matthew Brady's team photographed thousands of deceased soldiers, creating a vast archive of loss. This widespread documentation of death began to shift cultural attitudes, making death seem less intimate and more industrialized. Medical photography also influenced the practice, as doctors began photographing unusual cases, including children with congenital conditions who died young. These clinical images sometimes blurred into family portraits when doctors offered copies to parents, creating photographs that now strike modern viewers as uncomfortably straddling the line between medical documentation and memorial. As photography became cheaper and faster in the 1880s, the urgent need for post-mortem photography diminished. Families could now afford multiple photographs of their children while they were alive. Medical advancements also significantly reduced child mortality. The 1918 flu pandemic, which claimed millions of lives, made death too common and too horrifying to be memorialized beautifully, further contributing to a societal shift from Victorian death culture to a more modern death denial. By 1900, while many photographers still offered the service, they no longer advertised it openly. The practice became associated with poverty and the inability to afford earlier portraits, gradually receding into the shadows. The psychological toll on photographers was severe. many reported nightmares, and an inability to photograph living children without seeing death. Samuel Kona, a Philadelphia studio owner from 1855 to 1890, documented his mental struggles writing, "I see death in every child's face now. The line blurs until I cannot tell which side of mortality I'm capturing." Despite their unsettling nature, modern psychologists who study these images note the genuine tenderness and care evident in many. They argue these weren't morbid exploitations but desperate attempts to preserve memory. Dr. Stanley Burns, who has collected over 4,000 post-mortem photographs, contends they represent profound love in the face of unbearable loss. The technical skill required, the precise positioning, lighting, and chemical mixtures demonstrates that photographers viewed these final portraits as their most important work. The practice compels us to confront our modern discomfort with death. Victorians lived intimately with death. Bodies were often kept at home, prepared by family, and mourned openly. Children grew up viewing death as a natural part of the life cycle. Post-mortem photography was just one element of a culture that faced mortality directly. Our contemporary sanitization of death, hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes, might explain our horror at these images, reflecting our own inability to truly confront mortality. Yet, certain aspects remain genuinely disturbing. The uncanny valley effect, where something appears almost, but not quite human, triggers deep discomfort. Dead eyes painted to look alive, bodies propped in lifelike poses, and the unnerving, sharp clarity of the deceased against blurred living figures all create a profound sense of unease. These images occupy a liminal space between life and death that our brains struggle to process. While widespread post-mortem photography declined with the advent of accessible cameras like the Kodak, "You press the button, we do the rest" campaign in 1888, it never entirely vanished. In some cultures, the practice continues today. Modern hospitals sometimes offer memorial photography for stillborn infants or children who die young, and organizations like Now I Lay Me Down to Sleep provide free professional photography for families experiencing such profound loss. The same fundamental impulse that drove Victorians, the desperate need to preserve memory in the face of loss, continues, though it is now largely hidden from mainstream view. What these photographs ultimately reveal is the universality of parental grief across cultures and centuries. Losing a child represents the deepest human pain. These images, disturbing as they may be, document love persisting beyond death. The parents who paid a week's wages for a photograph of their dead child weren't morbid. They were desperate to hold on to something, anything, of what they had lost. The technical artistry involved should not be overlooked. These photographers developed incredible skills, using mirrors to direct light, mixing chemicals to achieve perfect exposure, and hand-painting intricate details invisible to their cameras. They were artists working in the most difficult medium imaginable: human grief. Their work preserves not just faces, but entire emotional worlds. So, the next time you casually snap a photo of your loved ones, take a moment to remember the Victorians, who often only had one chance after it was already too late. These haunting images serve as a powerful reminder that photography was once precious, rare, and deeply intertwined with loss. They challenge us to reflect on how we document our lives and what we choose to remember. The Victorians confronted death directly, memorialized it openly, and created art from anguish.